Resuming from the U.S. Energy Information Administration website. Crude oil and petroleum statistics. Data for the United States for 2022, unless otherwise indicated. Units are in barrels per day, B/D, except where noted. Prices are nominal prices. Check the glossary. It says nominal price, the price paid for a product or service at the time of transaction. Nominal prices are those that have not been adjusted to remove the effect of changes in the power of the dollar. They reflect buying power in the year in which the transaction occurred. Back to the page. Supply. Petroleum production, crude oil, natural gas liquids, renewable fuels, and processing gain. 20,078,900 barrels per day. Crude oil production, 11,910,622 barrels per day. U.S. crude oil imports, 6,281,296 barrels per day. Petroleum product imports, 2,047,526 barrels per day. Net crude oil and petroleum product imports, minus 1,191,009 barrels per day. Dependence on net petroleum imports. Net imports as share of products supplied, minus or negative 6.0%. Top crude oil import source, Canada, 3,798,000 barrels per day. Top total petroleum import source, Canada, 4,365,000 barrels per day. Crude oil imports from OPEC, 979,000 barrels per day. Petroleum product imports from OPEC, 275,000 barrels per day. Top crude oil producing state, Texas, 5,060,000 barrels per day. Next section is composition and disposition. Petroleum consumption, product supplied, 20,010,000 barrels per day. Motor gasoline consumption, 8,810,000 barrels per day. In parentheses, 370.020 million gallons per day. Transportation sector share of total petroleum consumption, 68%. Total petroleum exports, 9,520,000 barrels per day. Prices. Next section, prices nominal. Domestic crude oil first purchase price, wellhead price, $93.97 per barrel. Refiner acquisition cost of crude oil, composite, $95.29 per barrel. Motor gasoline retail price, all grades average, $4.059 per gallon. Regular grade motor gasoline retail price $3.951 per gallon. Premium grade motor gasoline retail price $4.744 per gallon. Federal tax on motor gasoline 18.4 cents per gallon. Average state taxes and fees on motor gasoline 32.26 cents per gallon as of July 1st, 2023. Federal tax for on-highway diesel fuel 24.40 cents per gallon. Average state fuel taxes and fees for on-highway diesel fuel 34.20 cents per gallon as of July 1st, 2023. Next section, refining and reserves. Number of operable petroleum refineries as of January 1st, 2023. 129. Largest refinery in distillation capacity as of January 1st, 2023. Port Arthur, Texas. Motiva Enterprises, LLC. 626,000 barrels per day. Top petroleum refining state as of January 1st, 2023. Texas. 5,975,969 barrels per day. Proved reserves of crude oil as of December 31st, 2021. 41 billion 151 million, and in parentheses that is 41.15 billion barrels per day. Total crude oil stocks as of December 31st, 2022, 802,132,000 barrels. Next section, international. World total petroleum production, 2022. 97,698,105 barrels per day. World total petroleum consumption, 2021. 97,264,198 barrels per day. Measures. Gallons, U.S., of oil per barrel, 42. Last updated October 2nd, 2023, with most recent data available. So first, this was from the data and statistics section. Now I'm going to go to this section which is called Where Our Oil Comes From. Where oil is produced. The United States is one of the top crude oil producers. The United States became the world's top crude oil producer in 2018 and maintained the lead position through 2022. U.S. oil refineries obtain crude oil produced in the United States and in other countries. Different types of companies supply crude oil to the world market. Crude oil is produced in over half of U.S. states. Crude oil is produced in 32 U.S. states and in U.S. coastal waters. In 2022, 5 states combined accounted for about 72% of total U.S. crude oil production. the top 5 crude oil producing states and their percentage shares of total U.S. crude oil production in 2022 were Texas, 42.5%, New Mexico, 13.3%, North Dakota, 8.9%, Colorado, 3.7%, Alaska, 3.7%. Data source, U.S. Energy Information Administration, Petroleum Supply Annual, Volume 1, Table 14, August 2023. Note, includes crude oil and lease condensation. Data for Alaska, California, Louisiana, and Texas include production in state-administered coastal waters. In 2022, about 14.5% of U.S. crude oil was produced from wells located in the federal offshore Gulf of America, and about 0.1% was produced in federal offshore Pacific, California, in parentheses. U.S. crude oil production by state, 2022. So it is color coded. If the color is gray, the number is 0. So there are numerous states that are 0, so I will read them off. You have Washington State, you have Oregon, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, the District of Columbia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. Next section is color-coded a beige type of color, beige I'll just say, and it is less than 1,000. And those states are Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana. My apologies, let me start over. My apologies. It's misreading, but anyways, the correct states are Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, South Dakota, Missouri, Tennessee, Virginia, and New York. The next section is between 1,000 and 10,000. So we've got Nebraska, Arkansas, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, Alabama, Florida, and Pennsylvania. And I'm going to jump back over to the other section where the number was 0. I forgot to add in Hawaii to that list. So Hawaii, according to this graphic, does not produce oil or crude oil. So next section, it is between 10,000 and 100,000. Starting off, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Ohio, and West Virginia. Next section, we have the range between 100,000 and 500,000. California, Colorado, Oklahoma, North Dakota, and Alaska. And lastly, greater than 500,000, which we have New Mexico and Texas. Data source, U.S. Energy Information Administration, Petroleum Supply Annual, August 2023. Note, crude oil includes lease condensate. Resuming the reading. Although total U.S. crude oil production generally declined between 1985 and 2008, annual production increased nearly each year from 2009 through 2019, reaching a record high in 2019. More cost-effective drilling technology helped to boost production, especially in Texas, New Mexico, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Colorado. U.S. crude oil production declined in 2020 and 2021, mainly because of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy. In 2022, production increased about 6% from 2021. Many countries produce crude oil. In 2022, 98 countries produced about 80.75 million barrels of crude oil, and 5 of those countries accounted for about 52% of the total. The top 5 crude oil producers and their percentage shares of world crude oil production in 2022 were 14.7% United States, 13.2% Saudi Arabia, 12.7% Russia, 5.6% Canada, 5.5% Iraq. Data source, U.S. Energy Information Administration, International Energy Statistics, crude oil production including lease condensate as of September 6, 2023. Top 5 crude oil producing countries, 1980 to 2022. For the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, numbers range from 0 to 13, and the vertical axis, or y-axis, ranges from 1980 to 2020, and 2022 at the edge. Data source, U.S. Energy Information Administration, International Energy Statistics, as of September 6, 2023. Note, includes crude oil and lease condensate. Ranking based on production in 2022. USSR is Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Different types of oil companies supply crude oil. The world oil market is complex. Governments and private companies play various roles in moving crude oil from producers to consumers. In the United States, companies produce crude oil on private and public land and in offshore waters. Most of these companies are independent producers, and they usually operate only in the United States. The other companies, often referred to as major oil companies, may have hundreds or thousands of employees and operate in many countries. Examples of major U.S. oil companies are Chevron and ExxonMobil. Three types of companies supply crude oil to the global oil market. Each type of company has different operational strategies and production-related goals. International oil companies. International oil companies, IOCs, which include ExxonMobil, BP, and Royal Dutch Shell, are entirely investor-owned and primarily interested in increasing value for their shareholders. As a result, IOCs tend to make investment decisions based on economic factors. IOCs typically move quickly to develop and produce the oil resources available to them and sell their output in the global market. Although these producers must follow the laws of the countries in which they produce oil, their decisions are ultimately made in the interest of the company and its shareholders, not in the interest of a government. National oil companies. National oil companies, NOCs, operate as extensions of a government or government agency, and they include companies such as Saudi Aramco, Saudi Arabia, Pemex, Mexico, and the China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC, and Petróleos de Venezuela, SA, PDVSA. NOCs financially support government programs and sometimes provide strategic support. NOCs often provide fuels to their domestic consumers at a lower price than the fuels they provide to the international market. They do not always have the incentive, means, or intention to develop their reserves at the same pace as investor-owned international oil companies. Because of the diverse objectives of their supporting governments, NOCs pursue goals that may not be market-oriented. The goals of NOCs often include employing citizens, furthering a government's domestic or foreign policies, generating long-term revenue to pay for government programs, and supplying inexpensive domestic energy. All NOCs that belong to members of OPEC fall into this category. Going to the glossary. Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, OPEC. Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, an intergovernmental organization whose stated objective is to, quote, coordinate and unify the petroleum policies of member countries, end quote. It was created at the Baghdad Conference on September 10 through 14, 1960. Current members with years of membership include Algeria, 1969 to the present. Equatorial Guinea, 2017 to present. Gabon, 1975 to 1994 and 2016 to present. Iran, 1960 to present. Iraq, 1960 to present. Kuwait, 1960 to present. Libya, 1962 to present. Nigeria, 1971 to present. Republic of Congo, June 2018 to present. Saudi Arabia, 1960 to present. United Arab Emirates, 1967 to present. And Venezuela, 1960 to present. Resuming the reading. NOCs with strategic and operational autonomy. These NOCs function as corporate entities and do not operate as extensions of their country's governments. This category includes Petrobras, Brazil, and Statoil, Norway, among others. These companies often balance profit-oriented concerns and the objectives of their countries with the development of their corporate strategies. Although these companies are driven by commercial concerns, they may also take into account their nation's goals when making investment or other strategic decisions. OPEC members and Persian Gulf countries have a large share of world oil supplies. OPEC is a group that includes some of the world's most oil-rich countries. OPEC members at the beginning of 2021 held about 72% of the world's total proved crude oil reserves, and in 2022 accounted for about 38% of total world crude oil production. Each OPEC country has at least one NOC, but most also allow IOCs to operate within their borders. In 2022, 7 countries in the Persian Gulf produced about 32% of total world crude oil, and they held about 49% of world proved crude oil reserves at the start of 2021. Did you know OPEC and Persian Gulf countries are not the same? OPEC was organized in 1960 to negotiate with oil companies on matters of oil production, prices, and future concession rights. Of the 13 OPEC member countries at the end of 2021, only 5 of them were Persian Gulf countries. The OPEC members, in bold, in the table below, are also in the Persian Gulf. And those specific countries are Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates. So, I read the OPEC members a few minutes ago, so I will just read the Persian Gulf countries, which include Bahrain, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates. Last updated September 21st, 2023, with data available at the time of update. Next section, where oil comes from. How is crude oil found and produced? The search for crude oil begins with geologists who study the structure and history of rock layers below the Earth's surface to locate areas that may contain deposits of oil and natural gas. And because this stock photo is copyrighted, I'm not going to describe it or show it. Geologists often use seismic surveys on land and in the ocean to find the right places to drill wells. Seismic surveys on land use echoes from a vibration source at the surface of the Earth, usually a vibrating pad under a special type of truck. Geologists can also use small amounts of explosives as a vibration source. Seismic surveys conducted in the ocean rely on blasts of sound that create sonic waves to explore the geology beneath the ocean floor. If a site seems promising, an exploratory well is drilled and tested. From the glossary, exploratory well, a hole drilled, A, to find and produce oil or gas in an area previously considered unproductive area, and, B, to find a new reservoir in a known field, i.e., one previously producing oil and gas from another reservoir, or C, to extend the limit of a known oil or gas reservoir. Resuming the reading. If enough oil is found to make it financially worthwhile to pursue, developmental wells are drilled. The type of well that is drilled depends on the location, geology, and oil resource. Pausing the reading to go to the glossary to read the definition. Developmental well. A well drilled within the approved area of an oil or gas reservoir to the depth of a stratigraphic horizon known to be productive. Also see well. Resuming the reading. Advances in drilling and production technologies have increased U.S. oil production. In the past, a drilling rig drilled a single vertical well. Now, many directional or horizontal wells can be drilled from one location, or well pad, to access greater areas of oil and natural gas bearing rock. Oil may flow to the Earth's surface from natural pressure in the rock formation, or it may have to be forced out of the ground and up through a well. The type of geologic formation where the oil is located determines the technologies used to start the flow of oil and natural gas from the reservoir or resource-bearing rock into the wells. So there are two diagrams. Zoom in. On the left, it's, as you can see from video, a schematic of different types of oil and natural gas wells. The source is Wyoming State Geological Survey, public domain, and on the right you've got a schematic of the basic types of oil and natural gas deposits, which the source is also from Wyoming State Geological Survey, public domain. Resuming the reading. Hydraulic fracturing is used to access the oil and natural gas contained in tiny pores of rock formations composed of shale, sandstone, and carbonate, limestone. Hydraulic fracturing breaks up the rock in the formations and creates pathways that allow oil and natural gas to escape from the rock layers. Hydraulic fracturing involves forcing water, chemicals, and sand or other propants, materials used to keep the pathways open under high pressure into the wells. Steam, water, or carbon dioxide, CO2, can also be injected into a rock layer to help oil flow more easily into production wells. After the oil has been collected from wells in a production field, pipelines begin, barges, trains, let me read that again. After the oil has been collected from wells in a production field, pipelines, barges, trains, or trucks transport the oil to refineries or to ports for shipment on oil tankers to other countries. Conventional and unconventional production. Production of crude oil and natural gas is sometimes called conventional production or unconventional production. Pausing the reading to go to the glossary to read this definition. Conventional oil and natural gas production. Crude oil and natural gas that is produced by a well drilled into a geologic formation in which the reservoir and fluid characteristics permit the oil and natural gas to readily flow to the well bore. The next, that was conventional. I will now go to unconventional oil and natural gas production, which is an umbrella term for oil and natural gas that is produced by means that do not meet the criteria for conventional production. See conventional oil and natural gas production. Note, what has qualified as, quote, unconventional, end quote, at any particular time is a complex interactive function of resource characteristics, the available exploration and production technologies, the current economic environment, and the scale, frequency, and duration of production from the resource. Perceptions of these factors inevitably change over time, and they often differ among users of the term. For these reasons, the scope of this term will be expressly stated in any EIA publication that uses it. For example, see International Energy Outlook, Table E4, for the list it currently uses for unconventional oil and natural gas production. Resuming the reading. Conventional production generally means that crude oil and natural gas flow to and up a well under the natural pressure of the earth. Unconventional production requires techniques and technologies to increase or enable oil and natural gas production beyond what might occur using conventional production techniques. In the United States, most of the new oil and natural gas production activities on land use unconventional production technologies. Tight oil production. The U.S. oil and natural gas industry uses the term tight oil to mean different geologic formations producing oil at a specific well. Tight oil is produced from low permeability sandstones, carbonates, for example, limestone, and shale formations. The U.S. Energy Information Administration uses the term tight oil to refer to all reserves, and production associated with low permeability formations that produce oil, including shale formations. Noticeable tight oil formations include Bakken and Three Forks formations in the Williston Basin, Eagle Ford, Austin Chalk, Buda, and Woodbine formations along the Gulf Coast, Strawberry, Wolf Camp, Bone Spring, Delaware, Glorieta, and Yeso formations in the Permian Basin, Niobrara formation in the Denver-Julesburg Basin. Next we have another graph titled Monthly U.S. Tight Oil Production by Formation, and it is on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, you have the numbers 0 through 10, 0 at the bottom, 10 at the top, and it signifies million barrels per day. And then on the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, you've got the years 2009 on the far left, all the way to 2025, and a small space to signify 2026, I'm assuming. And it's color coded. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's 8. There's the whitish gray color, or very light gray color, which is for the Permian. Next you've got a reddish color for Bakken. Next you have orange for Eagle Ford, yellow for Niobrara, Codell. Next you have lime green for Austin Chalk. You got an orangish brown for the Mississippian. You got dark brown for Woodford, and then gray for the rest of USA. The source is U.S. Energy Information Administration Short-Term Energy Outlook, April 2026. That it says, page updated October 4, 2023, U.S. tight oil production, selected plays chart, updated on June 11, 2024. I'll move on to the next section. Oil imports and exports. The United States became a total petroleum net exporter in 2020. In 2020, the United States became a net exporter of petroleum for the first time since at least 1949. Footnote 1. In 2022, total petroleum exports were about 9.52 million barrels per day, and total petroleum imports were about 8.33 million barrels per day, making the United States an annual net petroleum exporter for the third year in a row. Total petroleum net exports were about 1.19 million barrels per day in 2022. Also in 2022, the United States produced, footnote 2, about 20.08 million barrels per day of petroleum, and consumed, footnote 3, about 20.01 million barrels per day. Although U.S. annual total petroleum exports were greater than total petroleum imports in 2020, 2021, and 2022, the United States still imported some crude oil and petroleum products from other countries to help to supply domestic demand for petroleum and to supply international markets. The United States remained a net crude oil importer in 2022, importing about 6.28 million barrels per day of crude oil and exporting about 3.58 million barrels per day. Some of the crude oil that the U.S. imports is refined by U.S. refineries into petroleum products such as gasoline, heating oil, diesel fuel, and jet fuel that the U.S. later exports. Also, some of imported petroleum may be stored and later exported. U.S. petroleum imports peaked in 2005. After generally increasing every year from 1954 through 2005, U.S. gross and net total petroleum imports peaked in 2005. Since 2005, increased domestic petroleum production and increased petroleum exports have helped to reduce annual total petroleum net imports. So we have a line graph here titled U.S. Petroleum Consumption, Production, Imports, Exports, and Net Imports, years 1950 to 2022. On the x-axis, it's measured in million barrels per day, ranging from at the very bottom -4, and it goes all the way up to 22. So the source for this graph is U.S. Energy Information Administration Monthly Energy Review, Table 3.1, dated September 2023. Resuming the reading. Shares of U.S. petroleum imports from OPEC and Persian Gulf countries have declined, and the share of imports from Canada has increased. U.S. petroleum imports rose sharply from the 1970s, especially from members of OPEC. In 1977, when the United States exported relatively small amounts of petroleum, OPEC nations were the source of 70% of U.S. total petroleum imports and the source of 85% of U.S. crude oil imports. Since 1977, the percentage shares of U.S. total petroleum and crude oil imports from OPEC countries have generally declined. Saudi Arabia, the largest OPEC petroleum exporter to the United States, was the source of 7% of U.S. total petroleum imports and 7% of U.S. crude oil imports. Saudi Arabia is also the greatest source of U.S. petroleum imports from Persian Gulf countries, about 12% of U.S. total petroleum imports and 12% of U.S. crude oil imports were from Persian Gulf countries in 2022. So here's another line graph titled U.S. petroleum imports, total and from OPEC, Persian Gulf, and Canada, 1960 to 2022. I'm not going to describe this one. I will just show it for the video, and the link is on the top in the search bar. So I'm going to move on. Petroleum imports from Canada have increased significantly since the 1990s, and Canada is now the largest single source of U.S. petroleum and crude oil imports. In 2022, Canada was the source of 52% of U.S. gross total petroleum imports and 60% of gross crude oil imports. The top 5 sources of U.S. total petroleum, including crude oil, imports by percentage share of total petroleum imports in 2020 were 52% Canada, 10% Mexico, 7% Saudi Arabia, 4% Iraq, 3% Colombia. The top 5 sources of U.S. crude oil imports by percentage share of U.S. total crude oil imports in 2022 were 60% Canada, 10% Mexico, 7% Saudi Arabia, 4% Iraq, 4% Colombia. Did you know OPEC and Persian Gulf countries, okay, I already mentioned this in a previous part, it's just giving us the same message. Most U.S. total petroleum exports are petroleum liquids and refined petroleum products. Because of logistical, regulatory, and quality considerations, exporting some petroleum is the most economical way to meet the market's needs. For example, refiners in the U.S. Gulf Coast region frequently find that it makes economic sense to export some of their gasoline to Mexico rather than shipping it to the U.S. East Coast, because lower cost gasoline imports from Europe may be available to the East Coast. Petroleum liquids include hydrocarbon gas liquids, HGLs. HGL exports, mainly propane, have increased substantially since 2008, and in 2022 were about 25% of total U.S. total petroleum gross exports. The top 5 destinations of U.S. total petroleum exports, including crude oil, by percentage share of U.S. total gross petroleum exports in 2022 were 12% Mexico, 9% for Canada, 7% for China, 6% for South Korea, 6% for the Netherlands. The top 5 destinations of U.S. crude oil exports by percentage share of U.S. total crude oil exports in 2022 were 10% South Korea, 10% the Netherlands, 9% Canada, 9% United Kingdom, 9% Singapore. U.S. Next section. U.S. net petroleum imports by type. Okay, this is a bar graph. Year is 1960 to 2022. On the x-axis, you have million barrels per day. At the top, you have 15 million barrels per day. On the bottom, you have -5. And then it's color-coded. For the blue, you have crude oil. The orange, you have refined products and other. And the gray, you have hydrocarbon gas liquids. I will leave it here, and I will move on. Some companies purchase imported crude oil and gasoline. Although we cannot identify which companies sell imported gasoline or gasoline refined from imported oil, we publish data on the companies that import petroleum into the United States. A company that imports crude oil does not necessarily use those imports to produce the gasoline sold as that company's brand of gasoline. Gasoline from different refineries and import terminals is often combined when shipped by pipeline. Different companies owning service stations in the same area may be purchasing gasoline at the same bulk terminal, which may or may not include imported gasoline or gasoline refined from imported oil. So at the bottom we have each of the 3 footnotes. So footnote 1 was a reference to petroleum is a broadly defined class of liquid hydrocarbon mixtures that include crude oil, lease condensate, unfinished oils, and products produced from refining crude oil. and from processing natural gas plant liquids, including hydrocarbon gas liquids. Volumes of unfinished petroleum products include non-hydrocarbon compounds such as fuel ethanol, biodiesel, additives, and detergents that are blended into the products. Footnote 2 says, U.S. domestic petroleum production includes field production of crude oil and natural gas liquids, renewable fuels, and oxygenate plant net production, and refinery processing gain. Footnote 3 says, consumption is represented by product supplied. That is the end of this page, and it says, last updated January 19, 2024, with data from the Petroleum Supply Annual, August 2023, and Monthly Energy Review, September 2023. Next section, offshore oil and natural gas. The coastlines of the United States are not borders of the United States. The U.S. border is actually 200 miles away from the U.S. coastline. This area around the country is called the Exclusive Economic Zone, EEZ, and energy production in the area is called offshore production. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan claimed the EEZ in the name of the United States. In 1994, all countries were granted an EEZ of 200 miles from their coastlines under the international law of the sea. So I may just make this video a audio only and leave a URL in the description on the left hand side. This is a copyrighted stock photo of an image of a coastline. On the right hand side it says map showing exclusive economic zone around the United States and territories. EEZ in gray says within the picture, and it's so you have a line. So for example, around the continental United States, the 48 states between Mexico and Canada, you have a line going, I'll start off from the Texas region and Nevada and New Mexico, going along then from that border into the formerly known as Gulf of Mexico, now Gulf of America, down over, and then it goes into Florida, probably near Key West, those islands off the coast of Florida, and it goes north near the Bermuda Triangle, and it just goes all the way up until, I think that's Maine, because right around there is the northeastern Canadian border. Then of course around the Great Lakes to the west, all the way by the US-Canada line, and then and then we end up on the far left, top far left, where you have Vancouver and Washington State. And then go down, you have that area near Washington, Oregon, and California. And then you have the line basically covering the state of Alaska, and then some distance and islands away from mainland Alaska. Then you've got Hawaii, you've got American Samoa, you've got just other U.S. territories. So I'm going to leave it at that and resume the reading. The ocean floor gradually descends from the shoreline into the ocean on a continental shelf. The width of the U.S. continental shelf varies from 10 miles to 250 miles, 16 kilometers to 400 kilometers. The water on the continental shelf is relatively shallow, rarely more than 500 feet to 650 feet, or 150 meters to 200 meters deep. The ocean floor drops sharply from the shelf down a continental slope to abysmal plains that are 2 miles to 3 miles, 3 kilometers to 5 kilometers below sea level. Many of the plains are flat, but others have jagged mountain ridges, deep canyons, and valleys. The tops of some of these mountain ridges form islands where they extend above the water. And then here is a diagram which is available on the public domain. Source is National Energy Education Development Project, titled Diagram of Shore and Ocean Overlaid with Territorial Sea, Exclusive Economic Zone, the Continental Shelf and Continental Slope. So, just finish the page. Several federal government agencies manage the natural resources in the EEZ. The U.S. Department of the Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement manage the development of offshore energy resources by private companies. These companies lease some offshore areas for energy development from the federal government. These companies pay royalties to the government on the energy resource they produce from the leased areas in the ocean. Most states control the 3-mile area that extends off their coasts, but Florida, Texas, and some other states control the waters for as much as 9 miles to 12 miles off their coasts. Next section, offshore oil and natural gas production.